Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 12th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 presidential forecast from 538, in which today marks the first time since the beginning of July that President Biden now reclaims an advantage over President Trump in the head-to-head 2024 election matchup. Now, 538 has been tracking the race for months on end now, going through hypothetical scenarios of a Biden victory, a Trump victory, and averaging out polling numbers, economic indicators, unemployment rates, different factors that are important in understanding why an election might go the way that it does. And in its first model on the presidential level, since Nate Silver's departure from 538, G. Elliott Morris, who is now taking it over here, he used to work at The Economist, now works for 538 and ABC News, we are starting to see a model that sort of differentiates from what we might see even from The Economist, but also from Nate Silver himself. And so 538 now comes at a standing point where it may prove to be either the most accurate model or most inaccurate model, and will really find its way as it is valued by political pundits, valued by political analysts, valued by politicians in general, because for a long period of time, 538 has been looked to largely as this gold standard for election forecasting. But it's not always right. Back in 2022, it severely overestimated Republicans, said they would win numerous governorships that they didn't end up winning, Senate elections, House elections, and so in 2016, it also was on the inverse side. You saw Democrats overestimated in the Senate, in the House, in the presidential election, and so really 2024, again, is going to be this very defining moment for 538 here, but one thing we cannot ignore is when a reputable source like 538 comes out and shows President Biden now ahead roughly by 1 to 2 points nationwide for the first time again since the beginning of July, since the first real hit of the debate started taking on in national polls and statewide polls, and it now comes at a time where President Biden desperately needs a bailout when you're talking about media coverage. Almost all the media coverage we have seen over the past 2 weeks alone has been about the presidential debate, talking about how Biden is doomed. Biden is not going to win. That has been the mainstream media narrative. And yet, here we are, 538 putting a complete halt to that with a forecast showing Biden in the advantage point. And so I want to actually explore exactly some of these recent polls here that might be contributing to this change in overall makeup. And honestly speaking, almost all these recent polls here show Biden losing to Donald Trump by 1 to 3 points. And while that may at face value seem like this election is inevitably going to go to the Republican Party, 538 takes into account factors that extend well beyond just simple polling data. They also look at regular voting, registered voter data, likely voter data. They look at 2022 and 2020 and 2018 and 2016 election data. They take a look at many different things, what they like to call non-polling fundamentals, unemployment rate, economic factors, things related to healthcare, all across the country. I mean, different factors in different parts that we talk about that make up this huge model and forecast here. And so when you look at the polls initially, and this is what, again, the media has really been running with recently, that Trump is on track for a landslide victory. It's going to be an easy slam dunk for the former president. But in reality, that's not where we are. And so I want to actually take a look at just how exactly narrow this race is, but really how it has changed over time. They didn't release this model back in April when Biden was riding high, really in a strong point, 62% chance of victory, 58% chance of victory. By the time they released the model, Biden had a 51 to 49 advantage. It was the end of May. It was coming around a time in which the general election season was really ramping up. It was a month out from the first presidential debate, so it certainly was coming at a time where people wanted to see what the forecast would say before and after the debate, so it came at a really interesting point where the election was just as narrow then as it is today. And to give you more of an understanding of what that might mean for a forecast like this one, Biden was leading before the debate a month prior, and now is leading 2 weeks after the debate. So, you know, we are in very, very different circumstances, but at the end of the day, Biden is still running largely where he was 2 months ago, a month before the debate. You know, really, really good numbers, I would say, for someone who has had such a media barrage of attacks being thrown onto him. Multiple congressmen, up to 20 people now across both chambers of Congress calling for President Biden to step back and allow Vice President Harris or an open convention or whatever they decide to put in their statement out there. I mean, we are talking potentially about one of the worst 2 weeks Biden has ever seen in political history for his campaigns. I mean, you are talking potentially worse than him removing himself out of the race in 1988 and in 2008. This is a very, very bad 2 weeks for the Biden campaign, and yet, he holds strong on 538 and comes at a point where it is his first lead again for the entire month of July. Right as July began, the instant polls we started seeing coming in over the past 2-3 days after the debate, Trump ahead, Trump ahead, Trump ahead. Trump takes the lead. 50% chance of victory goes to 52, 53, 54, peaks up about an 8-point difference between the two, the largest we have seen for any of the two candidates, going all the way back to before June. I think we're talking around, maybe here's the point, May 20th. So Trump took that part just a week and a half after the presidential debate. At that point, Democrats sort of said, we're done. It's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Democrats in saying that some of the more engaged people on election Twitter, some of the more engaged pundits like David Axelrod said that this is a point of no return, and evidently it returns. And so we have to look at these battleground states. Where is this return coming from? Where is Biden's all of a sudden newfound support coming from? Well, we first have to understand that while 538 does not take into account polls as the end-all be-all, they certainly do count them as this large piece of a puzzle. And so the polls that we've seen recently actually show that the presidential race is largely unchanged from prior to the debate. Northeastern University released a report saying that Biden's, quote, poor debate performance had almost no impact on voter preference, which is so exceptionally fascinating because we've been told and sold on this idea that this debate was going to ruin the Biden campaign if he lost it, and he did, in fact, lose it, according to the CNN numbers, according to a lot of the snapshot polls. And yet, again, here we are, nearly 3 weeks after the first presidential debate, with Biden up nationwide. And while this is not certainly a large lead, I mean, this is nothing like what we saw in 2020. A lead cannot be ignored based on what we have seen in contrary media coverage. So let's go ahead and unpack. This lead does not come easy. When you translate it to a popular vote victory, Biden is winning the popular vote by 2.2%. You know who also won by 2.2% roughly? Hillary Rodham Clinton. Now, the difference is, this electoral map here seems to be a little bit more favorable to President Biden than it was for Hillary Clinton back in 2016, meaning that Hillary Clinton had to do far better in the national popular vote to win the Electoral College than what Biden has to actually do. And when it translates to electoral votes, Biden wins 270, the exact number needed to win re-election. Right now in my forecast, I have him at 226. So what does 538 see that I don't? What does 538 take into account that puts Biden again back in the lead for the first time that we have seen since the presidential debate? And that comes down to 3 key battleground states that the Biden campaign has been very clear and adamant is their key pathway to victory: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, starting off in the state of Wisconsin, Biden has sort of rebounded from a lower point. Right after the debate, we saw that Trump went up to a 49% chance of victory against Joe Biden. Today, it's down to 46%. In terms of popular vote, it went from being a Biden plus 0.4% expected victory now to being roughly a point. Better than where it was back in 2020. Winner probability puts Biden over the finish line there. Then you have the state of Michigan, which at a low point for Biden was a 47% chance for Trump. Today it's down to nearly 40%. Nearly 3/5 of probability here, Biden wins Michigan. Went from a point where the popular vote was down to less than a point to now being nearly 2 points. And then, slamming in the trifecta here, Pennsylvania, 52% chance for Biden to win here. What we saw over time was that Biden and Trump were nearly tied. 51-49, a very, very narrow race. Biden has narrowly improved here despite being down in the polls. Popular vote went from Biden being up 0.4% to being up by 0.5%. And so minor improvements, but overall contribute to a 50-49 projected victory for President Biden. And so with 538, adding into this question of, what does the media have to say about this? What do the forecasters have to say about this? They also acknowledge that since the presidential debate, we really haven't seen the forecast move super, by large amounts. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the 538 forecast, unlike what we see with The Economist, which is more reliant on polls, unlike what we see with Nate Silver, who has adopted an entirely different model than what we are used to in 538, it pretty much shows that a lot of that is reactive to the immediate polls and doesn't take into account some of the more non-polling fundamentals that matter in an election. And not to discredit those pundits, right? I think they could entirely be right, and 538s could fade off into irrelevancy after this election, assuming that they are at such contrasting points. I mean, Nate Silver today has Biden down just a 28% chance at victory. 538 has them up 50, right? So you're talking about vastly different forecasts, again, from very similar people, very respectable people, but equally very different conclusions about this election. What they find, though, and what they acknowledge here, is that the polls do sort of swing a bit. But they haven't swung that much. They've swung maybe 1 or 2 points in favor of Donald Trump, and that isn't enough to say that this election has completely moved away from President Biden. They also recognize that a lot of the movement is going to happen in the fall. We are still 4 months out from the election. This is not an election that will be decided in July or even in June, even though that's when the first presidential debate was. This is an election that will be decided after Labor Day. This is an election that will be decided in the final stretch of September and October and, of course, November, when Democrats are in full force. The conventions have yet to hit. Trump hasn't even picked a VP. And so to write off this election would be a decision that would completely ruin the reputation of the Democratic Party for a very long time, because this election and every election, what we know on the presidential level, is far closer than what we expect. Both sides expect a landslide in some elections. In many realities, we have seen no landslides in the past 20, 30 years. The largest we've seen was Obama in 2008, which wasn't even larger than Bill Clinton's in 92 or in 96. And yet we largely see that as a landslide. But again, we're talking about landslides in the past days, talking about Reagan, talking about Nixon. Those are substantial landslides. We don't see those things today. And so for all this talk and conversation about how this is going to be a landslide victory for Donald Trump, in no circumstance does even 312 constitute as a landslide victory. Even though Donald Trump self-declared his 306 electoral vote victory over Hillary Clinton a landslide, again underperforming Obama twice, 312 is still not a landslide. This is an electoral map victory that is decisive, but is certainly not a landslide victory. And so Democrats, I think, are largely looking at this and panicking and saying, this is a map today, there's no reality in which we win it back. But take a look at some of these states. I mean, even on my own projection, which gives Donald Trump a far larger upper hand than what 538 says, than what even The Economist says, or the Nate Silver forecast says, I am one of the most, have some of the largest advantages for Donald Trump of any election forecaster out on the internet right now. And I think the large reason for that is because a lot of these are snapshots in time. They understand where the American electorate might be today, but 538 is focused on November. 538 is focused on what will happen between now and November 5th. And what they are finding is that Biden does in fact have the upper hand. And back to this point about Democrats looking at maps like this one and saying, we're done. It's over. Swap in Vice President Harris, swap in Governor Gavin Newsom, swap in Governor Gretchen Whitmer. This is not a winnable election with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Take a look at some of these states. What do we see today? Carrie Lake announced that she wants the Arizona Supreme Court to instate her as governor in Arizona. What do we find from research there done by Latino groups, done by voting groups, that Ruben Gallego might drag Joe Biden over the finish line, an up-ballot effect, the likes of which we have not seen in decades. Arizona could go. But you know what's more likely to go? Michigan and Pennsylvania. Two states that right now are the narrowest in my column for President Trump in a re-election victory that brings him to 312. Take those two states out, he's down to 278. Why does that matter? Because just Wisconsin or Arizona, heavy on the or, could go blue and Biden wins the election and it's a wrap. And so we have to understand that the pathway to 270, while seemingly narrow right now for President Biden, is certainly not without a reasonable expectation that Democrats could do it. It's certainly not without this possibility that Biden could somehow bring it back home. Because the map is not built to be this solid Republican, ruby red nation. This is an electoral map that is going to be close regardless of what happens at the second debate, regardless of what happens at the RNC, regardless of what happens at the DNC. This election will be close, and there is no way to dispute that. And as much as the Trump team genuinely believes it, because they believe this, you can see this with their own internal memos, the way they talk about the race, the way they discuss the race with the media, they believe this race is a landslide. They're going to win Minnesota. They're going to win Virginia. They're going to win Colorado. They're going to win New Mexico. They're not. They're not going to win any of those 4 states that I've mentioned right now. And so when Donald Trump gets to that ballot box in November, and Joe Biden does too, we are in for a very, very close election. And what 538's forecast suggests and shows is that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania will be the 3 that put Biden back on top, that put Biden to 270 electoral votes. But again, if not Wisconsin, then Arizona. If not Arizona, then Georgia. There is a pathway here for President Biden. And while it has gotten slimmer since that debate, based on what we've seen in media coverage, based on what we've seen in just hypothetical polls today, the 538 forecast remains largely unchanged and, in fact, puts President Biden right where he was prior to the debate. That is a good sign for a campaign that is looking for a good sign. That is an indication that Biden can still win this election. Will he win the election? Only time will tell. But as of now, and as of the current status of President Biden and President Trump, this 538 forecast is enough news for President Biden's team to remain in the race, enough news to point at it and say, we still have a strategic pathway to victory, because the data now backs it up entirely. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.